How is everyone this morning? It's nice to see a really full room. I just want to say thank you to Phoebe for inviting me to speak. I feel very honored to be speaking at the first Creative Mornings. And I also want to reiterate her acknowledgement to country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gaibil and Jarawar people, and specifically the storytellers, past, present, and emerging. Okay, I'm just going to take a deep breath before I begin. So I want to take you back to 1982. Yeah, cute guy, hey. What happened? It's Brisbane, Australia. Looking at this picture, it does bring a lot of memories back. So it's hot, humid, and the accents are long and lazy. It's a far cry from Toronto, Canada, where we've spent several years, and it's definitely a far cry from the southern Philippines, where my parents grew up. They were actually both the eldest of both their families, and they migrated later in search of a better life. So my sister and I and my parents, we ended up as many first arrivals at Yungabar Migrant Hostel. So for those of you who do know Brisbane, Yungabar Migrant Hostel is, and the building is still there. It's not operational now, but it's located under the iconic Story Bridge, which is that big Meccano-looking structure you see in Brisbane. And one of my earliest memories of living there for the short amount of time was the weekly social nights. So imagine, if you will, a hall. Spilling through the entry points are people from many different countries. There's a cacophony of different languages. There's an excitement in the air, a buzz. There's ice cream. And there's definitely dancing. One of the strongest visual images I have of going to those social nights was South Sea Islander women wearing their bright, bold, coloured printed shirts. That stuck with me for some reason. And so right from the very start, the idea of inclusion, that idea of being welcomed, of being valued, of being invited into something, that has been swirling around me as a child. So I've had to move through that as a concept, negotiate it in my mind, consolidate and reconcile it, and it's really impacted the way that I am as a person. And so because this is Creative Mornings, I want to talk about how this concept of inclusion has impacted the creative projects I do, and also the work that I've participated in and also initiated. So to give you a bit of context about what I do now, I kind of juggle two hats at the moment, or two balls. The first one is I'm a teacher, and I work at one of the biggest secondary schools on the Darling Downs, and it's definitely one of the most culturally diverse places that I've worked. And I am a teacher for students who have disabilities. And so as part of my role, I actually teach digital media skills and allow and empower these young people to tell stories and hopefully work towards telling their own story. I also work as what I loosely term a digital storyteller. So that's kind of a mismatch of whatever work I'm picking up that's related to video. So I do a lot of documentation for arts and cultural events. I also wear an arts administrator hat. I hustle for funding and then act as a creative director for Lit Festival, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. And I also freelance as a graphic designer. So in 2013, I actually needed a break from teaching. And I've been really fortunate that I've had some really good bosses who've understood that sometimes I do need to take a break. And I do realize that sometimes work is a season. You have to take a break so that you can reconnect with what you love and then do it even better. And so I was fortunate enough to land a job with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. and specifically with their project ABC Open. It's quite a progressive project, and the gist of it is that people from regional areas are given permission and the ability to share their stories through digital media and then share it right across the massive platform of the ABC. And so part of my job was teaching digital media skills, so allowing people to take better photos, work with video, and also engage in online writing and blogging. And I was also able to hit the road, and that's probably one of the best things I liked about it was doing the mini road trips. So I traveled to far-flung places such as Weengallen, Miles, St. George, and even to Texas. For those of you who don't know, there is a Texas in Queensland. And something I learned that has stuck with me to this present time is the value of stories. So from the very dawn of civilization, stories have connected us. They help us make sense of the world. They help us to navigate the unknown world. And despite language or cultural background or perceived boundaries or the boundaries that actually exist, there are universal themes in stories that allow us to connect. And something about stories that I learnt when I was in this role was the inclusive practice of listening. And so when I talk about listening, I'm talking about active listening. I'm talking about listening and putting your preconceived ideas or your bias or your agenda at the door and listening openly. Now, a bit of a caveat with listening as a way of being inclusive and being an inclusive practitioner. Not everyone is ready to share their story. Stories can be very personal, and there might be reasons why someone isn't ready to share their story. There has to be a lot of trust. There has to be a connection with that person. There is a certain amount of vulnerability that has to happen when someone shares their story as well. And there might have been a time when that person's story wasn't valued, or it wasn't believed, or it was used against them, or maybe that story is being used to define them now. And something I'm actually seeing in the media at the moment, as now a public person looking at the media as a consumer, is that migrant stories, often we're seeing just the traumatic stories. And while yes, that has happened, I don't think trauma stories should define people. There is more to migrant and new arrivals than just trauma. The everyday people like you and I. So, with my love of stories, jumping back to a year or two ago, with a group of like-minded people in the Toowoomba community, digital storytellers like myself, we decided to form a artist-run initiative called Story Art, which stands for Story Artists Run Collective. And as part of what we wanted to do is we wanted to have an arts event that allowed stories to be told from the local region, but also to show people what we did, but also present digital and new media art in a public context. So I want to talk about the way we can democratize space through stories. Now, traditionally, art has been seen in very traditional places. And I'm talking about the gallery, the theatre, the museum. And with these spaces comes a set of rules. And sometimes these rules are hidden. If you don't know the space of the gallery, the theatre, or the museum, or anything like that, that can be quite daunting. And that can be quite uncomfortable for people who don't know how to navigate that space. So there's a certain amount of cultural capital or knowledge that has to be taken on board before you can enter that space. And if you don't feel like you have that, then potentially that's going to be a place that is not welcoming or a place that you might not want to engage in. So what we wanted to do with our arts event is, with that in mind, we wanted to bring high quality art into the public space. And it's not a new thing. First Coat have done this before us quite beautifully. And so what we wanted to do is we provided a free event, but we also understood that when you put art in the public space, people can come and see it. They're not always there for it, and they can leave whenever they want. And there potentially isn't those rules that sit around those traditional spaces. So you can engage in the space. You might be actually just seeing it from the seat in a cafe or a restaurant. Or you might actually be there for it and participating in the workshops, and then also being challenged by the art that's presented in front of you. And also, we wanted to change the story around place. So this photo is actually from a work that we commissioned by Vida, who made up of some local artists, and it was in the Bell Street Mall. And for those of you who know the Bell Street Mall, historically, and this was before I lived here, it was the location for many social welfare agencies. And so over time, there has been a bit of a narrative around that space. And it's become a space that has lost a bit of life, but also a place that potentially is avoided. And it's also experiencing a bit of reactivation from different shops and bars and whatnot. But we wanted people to overlay their knowledge of that. We wanted people to come out at night, which in Toowoomba sometimes it feels like, oh, this is exciting, nighttime. And we wanted them to draw a story from the place, overlaid with their own personal story and maybe history with the space, and then take away from what the artists were presenting. So this was part of a theme around lit futures and what people wanted the future to look like. So as I mentioned before, I'm a graphic designer by trade. And essentially, a graphic designer's job is to provide a creative solution to a problem. Now, I've totally distilled it to something very basic, but that's how I see it. Imagine if you could embed that concept of inclusion in the creative process from the get-go. What would that look like? I'm currently working on a job for a upcoming LGBTQI event in Toowoomba. And I want to talk about the role of allies in the creative process. So involving that concept of inclusion from the get-go might look like that if you can include more people in the process so that more people can then enjoy the end product or the end event or the end outcome, that is a win. And so myself in this design process, I was briefed on the collateral, the posters and whatnot I had to design. So this is actually still in process. And I needed to get some feedback on it. So the best way for me to do that is to actually ask someone from the LGBTQI community. And so I'm fortunate enough to have a friend who was able to just send him the poster via email, and I got some great feedback. So often we get feedback or a critique at the end when it's too late. The outcome is already there. Inclusive practice means having allies from the very start. Because we do know that the decision makers are often what it looks like, it's very monocultural. It's only seen through one type of lens. So inclusive practice for me means that you, even before the project happens, you are seeing and allowing yourself to see a different story, to see a different narrative, the one that you're used to. So that then holistically informs your practice. I had to do a bit of research as well in this project. So this kind of color visual, they're all the flags that represent different communities within the LGBTQI spectrum, for want of a better word. And so to be able to get some feedback directly from someone in that community was important, but it's also a no-brainer, because if the event is for the LGBTQI community, why wouldn't I ask someone from that community? Makes sense. That's just one little insight on how inclusive practice could look like. And I want to stress that it's better to be proactive than reactive. It's better to put those things into place before you kind of realize, I didn't think of that, and it's all out there for the world. Now, being an inclusive practitioner can be challenging because you need to start questioning the power that you hold in your community or at your work or in your country that you live in, the space that you take up. You need to question and also reconcile the history and the story that you have personally and where you stand and what agency you have to actually do what you do. I acknowledge that I'm male, that I have had the opportunity to go and have an education, but I also acknowledge that I am Filipino. So that also lends to my story, and that's something that I'm slowly uncovering for myself. It's a work in progress. So that last bit, that's a lot. And some of you might not even know what I'm talking about. That's totally okay. But knowing your own story and then what sits outside your story, for me, is so personal that you will know that. So what I want to leave you today with is a nice starting point for starting to become a more inclusive, creative person, and for us as a whole to be an inclusive, creative community. And it's a simple question of who's missing. If you look around your workspace, who's missing? If you're in your boardroom, who's missing in that decision-making process? If you're in your gallery, who's missing? And that's the challenge. How do you then open it up so that that question is answered and that you broaden the idea that you've had in the first place? Thank you very much for listening.